The Big Ten football regular season has come to an end, which naturally means it's time to dig up those bookmarks. It's time to dig up what you and I thought in July and August of what might happen in the Big Ten season and talk about what actually happened in this Big Ten season in this retrospective edition of Big Nation.
From Pasadena to Piscataway, College Park to the Coliseum, Seattle to State College, Columbus to Camp Randall, the Zoo to the Rock, and everywhere in between. This is where Big Ten fans gather to talk America's premier national conference with your host, Big Ten Ted. All Big Ten, all year long. This is Big Nation.
Man, I still can't believe we are at the end of the regular season. It seems like just yesterday we were doing 18 consecutive days of Big Ten football previews. It seems like just yesterday I was on the Washington coast, the first day that Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA were officially members of the Big Ten Conference. Now we're sitting here in early December talking about the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis this Saturday. We're talking about who's making it to a bowl game, who's making it into the college football playoff. We're talking about all of that as it pertains to the Big Ten Conference. Man, the first year of the 18-team Big Ten Conference, it sure was a lot of fun. Thank you, of course, for coming along for the ride. Now, we're going to look back. What I got right, what I got wrong. We're going to take a look back at some of what you said in your bold predictions, what you got right, and what you got wrong. No, I'm not going to cover everything that we talked about in the bold predictions video from the summer. I'm going to link that in the description. There's some fun stuff in the comments. There's some more fun stuff that I talked about then that I won't necessarily talk about now, but we're going to hit the highlights certainly. Let's get into the standings, how I projected these teams to finish, how they actually ended up finishing. Now, this might be a little bit tough for those on the audio platforms and podcasts to follow, but I'm certainly going to do my best to help those audiences out. But for those of you on video, the numbers and the record in the column on the left is what I predicted back in August, and the column on the right is the overall record that they ended up with. No surprise that Oregon is at the top of the Big Ten. I predicted Oregon to win the Big Ten championship at the beginning of the season. Look, if you couldn't see that the Ducks were loaded on both lines of scrimmage and on defense, some people didn't see it. If you couldn't see it in July and August, man, I couldn't help you. Look at some of the segments that I did back then talking about the Oregon defense. I certainly had my eye on this team as one of the best teams in all of college football. I had them losing to Ohio State in the regular season at home and then ending up avenging that loss in the Big Ten championship. Of course, they ended up beating Ohio State in the regular season in October 12th in one of the best games of college football, certainly this year. But big props to the Ducks for going 12-0 this season. Of course, we need to talk about the Indiana Hoosiers. I predicted Indiana to go 6-6 at the beginning of the year. I thought Indiana would, in the front half of the schedule, I thought the Hoosiers would start pretty well, and they did end up starting, of course, pretty well, going undefeated through the first half of the regular season. Like, go back to my predictions video. I had Indiana beating Nebraska at home before Nebraska played Ohio State the following week. But in my predictions and in my projections, I thought Indiana, with a bunch of new coaches, with a bunch of new personnel, and a more difficult schedule in theory on the back half of the calendar for the Hoosiers, I thought, hey, maybe they would have some wins and losses, and maybe they would have some bumps in the road. But that didn't end up, of course, happening. But the pieces that they brought into Bloomington, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly where they were going to plug those pieces. And I think that production over potential model is really what propelled Indiana to what they became this season. And their journey is not over. They are going to be a college football playoff team. I'm so intrigued to see what this IU team can really do, responding from that Ohio State loss a couple of weeks ago, 66-0 over Purdue. But look, you know, this is, of course, me taking an L, being 5 games off the win total for the Indiana Hoosiers. But I'm not sure of anybody really that picked Indiana to win 10 games this season. Let's talk about the Illinois Fighting Illini. You know, when you get outside those college football playoff teams, that Illinois is the best of the rest in the Big Ten. A 9-3 season for the Orange and Blue boys from Champaign. Look, they lost to Penn State and they lost to Oregon. Outside of that, this team really took care of business most of the way. Of course, they had that loss to Minnesota, but this is, I think, the best coaching job of Brett Bielema's career. When he took over Illinois, right, this was a team that was at the Big Ten basement at that point in time. And then you look back at 2022, you had NFL guys, you had Johnny Newton on that roster, you had Chase Brown at the running back position on that roster, you had Devin Witherspoon, you had Sidney Brown, you had all those guys on the roster. And they went 8-4 that year. You look at Illinois this season, how many NFL guys are on that roster? Right? I don't think there's a ton of NFL guys, certainly, on the roster. I talked with Sonny Verma from Locked On Illini before the season, and we both thought that, hey, okay, bringing in Zachary Franklin, he's going to be that number one guy. We weren't sure that Pat Bryant could be that number one guy. He is and was and always will be a number one guy to this Illinois fan base. He's going to be a first-team All-Big Ten performer. If he's not, they should riot in Champaign, Illinois. He's put up some of the best numbers in the Big Ten this season. He was second in the Big Ten in receiving yards entering rivalry weekend. And then you look at the run game. Caden Fagan goes down in the season, yet they figure out a way with Josh McCray, with Aiden Lawfrey, who had a good game against Northwestern, with Kaleo Valentine. They just figured things out, and a great job, and a lot of props is deserved to Brett Bielema, Barry Lunny Jr., Aaron Henry, and this entire coaching staff over there of the Illinois Fighting Illini. We're going to get to Michigan a little bit later. I predicted them to go 10-2. They finished 7-5. Let's talk about Minnesota for a minute. They had a preseason over-under of 4.5 wins. And I told you then, I told you in September, October, November, I could have told you at any point within the last 4 or 5 months. That was an utterly ridiculous season over-under win total for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Now, I predicted, as I said before, Darius Taylor would be the leading rusher in the Big Ten Conference. I think, now he had a good year. He didn't have a great year. But here's what I would say about why Darius Taylor maybe did not have those type of numbers, is because Minnesota had their best quarterback since 2019. They had their best passing season in a handful of years, certainly in Dinkytown over there. Max Brosmer came in, and now all of a sudden this was a Minnesota team that was throwing the ball a lot more and wasn't just relying on pounding the run game play after play after play after play. They became a lot more balanced, and thus they became competitive in almost every single game that they played this season. Minnesota's margin to being like 9-3, razor thin. They should have beaten North Carolina in that opening game, right? They had a field goal opportunity with Dragan Kesic at the buzzer, and he missed it. Reigning Big Ten kicker of the year missed 2 field goals in that game. Bad onside call on the offsides against Michigan. They ended up losing by 3 in that game. You look at the Penn State game where they lost just by a single point in that particular matchup. Rutgers was kind of their one mulligan of this season, but this was a Minnesota team that was really close to having a really, really good year. Just another good coaching job by PJ Fleck as the head coach of this Minnesota Golden Gophers team. I had correct record predictions on 4 Big Ten teams, that being the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. They finished 7-5. Back-to-back bowl appearances for Greg Schiano over there. Washington at 6-6. Now, you kind of look at the Washington Huskies. If they convert that 4th down against Washington State and they get into the end zone, and if Grady Gross just makes a couple of easy field goals against Rutgers, we're looking at an 8-4 Washington team, and I think we're looking at a really successful first year in Seattle. Now, it didn't happen that way. You have to certainly take the results as they are. Huskies at 6-6. You saw Damon Williams in that game against Oregon. There is a bright spot that Washington can certainly build off of at quarterback for the future. Jed Fish is recruiting in about the top 30 right now, so that's a good sign for the future as well. They are certainly building things up. Wait for things in like year 3 of Jed Fish, and we'll really see where this Washington program is certainly at. But they just didn't have it on the lines of scrimmage this year, which is to be expected on the offensive line and the defensive line. UCLA and Michigan State both ended up at 5-7 this season as well. We'll talk about Nebraska and Wisconsin a little bit later, but as you can see, that's where kind of things certainly ended up with my predictions versus what actually happening. All right, folks, nobody is safe. It's time to take a look at what you projected and what you predicted in the bold predictions back in the summer. Let's start first with 3 comments on Twitter and YouTube from back in the summer, and let's see how they played out. This from @DAWS_101, Football 101 over there on Twitter said 2 former Pac-12 teams will be in the Big Ten championship game. Now, here's the scoop about all of this. Oregon. Yeah, that should be no surprise to anybody that they are in the Big Ten championship game. Myself and a lot of other people predicted them to be in that spot. But let's talk about it from USC. USC, and I predicted USC to beat LSU. They beat LSU to start off the season, and there is a lot of excitement from this Trojan fan base. They have a 3-point loss to Michigan thrown in there as well. They were bound. They're sitting there at 3-1 after a win against the Wisconsin Badgers. And then comes Minnesota. And then a little bit later comes the Maryland Terrapins. I think we'd be talking about a very different USC football team if they would have found a way to beat Minnesota and Maryland. If they would have beaten the Gophers, and if they would have beaten the Terrapins, and the loss to Maryland is the worst loss of the year. Maryland had one Big Ten win this year. It was against the USC Trojans. Oh no! Disaster! Eric Collins was an absolute stud on the mic this year. I just want to make sure I throw that in there certainly as well. Like if they would have beaten the Gophers and the Terps, they would have been 6-2 going into the Washington game. And those 2 losses would have been was that a 3-point loss? I think a 3-point loss to Michigan and then a 3-point overtime loss to the Penn State Nittany Lions. They would have been in the college football playoff discussion most likely. Okay, if they would have been able to finish out and run the table the rest of the way, which I know is a far cry from what actually happened, a win over Notre Dame, they'd be in that discussion with like a 3-loss South Carolina or a 3-loss Ole Miss or a 3-loss Alabama as maybe the last spot sitting there in the college football playoff. But as we know, that didn't happen with USC leading in the fourth quarter in a lot of these games. Did USC play a 60-minute game all year? I think the only one might have been their first game of the year against the LSU Tigers, where they came out very motivated. Now, I will say this about USC. Their defense improved tremendously this season. They took big strides up on the defensive side of the ball. I know the injury to Eric Gentry certainly didn't help out anything in Los Angeles over there, but they're building something, I think, on the defensive side of the football. You look as well for USC, and I think it also came down to a big question that we had in the preseason was who's going to step up at wide receiver? After that Wisconsin game, it certainly looked like Jacoby Lane was going to be the guy. And then he wasn't going to be the guy. You saw Deuce Robinson step up. You really saw Mekhi Lemon really step up towards the end of the season. I think we're still sitting here saying, who is the guy? It's probably Mekhi Lemon, right? But we've seen some good stuff from some other people as well. I just don't think these young receivers developed this season the way maybe USC fans certainly would have wanted. Of course, the offensive line issues led to some of the turnover issues that Miller Moss had towards the end of the season that kind of spiraled downwards, a 6-6 finish for the USC Trojans. That was going to be the other team. When you look at Football 101, when you look at that tweet, okay, it wasn't going to be Washington this year. It wasn't going to be UCLA this year. USC was the other team that could possibly make this happen, and it didn't happen. What a world we would have lived in if it would have been Oregon and USC in the Big Ten championship game, but it's just Oregon. Now, if Oregon goes out and they win in Indianapolis, they're saying that team out west, the Oregon Ducks, This is our league now, marching into the conference in year one. I think that's really going to cause the rest of the Big Ten to try to catch up to what Dan Lanning and the Ducks are certainly doing. This from a common commenter over on the YouTube side. This was 4 months ago. Kevin Chandler, Penn State fan, says, James Franklin finally trusts his coordinators, and my Nittany Lions go 11-1 at worst. Now, Kevin was correct here, where James Franklin put a lot of faith, put a lot of trust in the creativity and the wild formations that Andy Kotelnicki was throwing out there. And a big thumbs up and big props to Kevin and James Franklin for really trusting that Andy can take this offense to the next level. I think Tyler Warren really benefited from Andy Kotelnicki as an offensive coordinator. Things certainly have taken a step up in the right direction this year in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania. So credit to you, Kevin, for calling that out. Not exactly a bold prediction for Penn State to go 11-1, right? They didn't have Michigan on their schedule. Ohio State really was the tough game on their schedule. They ended up short, so shouldn't be surprising. And what does Penn State do? They just beat the unranked teams. They beat the teams that they're supposed to beat. That's exactly what happened with the blue and white this season. Nate Benter, this was over on Twitter. Based on all the projections, Purdue won't be last. Oh boy. But for real, bowl team with a win against Notre Dame. I think Nate was expecting the spoiler makers. And if there was one thing that we've now found out, the spoiler makers and Ryan Walters were not synonymous with each other. The spoiler makers was a Jeff Brom thing. All right? The plain and simple. That's the truth. I think where this thing really started for Purdue was the max exodus of some of these players in the transfer portal prior to the season. You saw Nick Scorton, a great defensive lineman, go to Texas A&M. You saw Deion Burks, their great wide receiver, transfer to Oklahoma. Like, that was a big deal. Because Deion Burks, I think, was supposed to be that next wide receiver in line where they've had a Rondale Moore, where they've had a David Bell, where they've had a Charlie Jones this last handful of seasons. And when they lost Deion Burks, there wasn't really a great receiver option that really stepped up. The offensive line didn't really improve that much. The defense regressed, and it ended up costing Ryan Walters his job. And Purdue, probably one of the worst Big Ten teams we've seen in some time. That 2022 Northwestern team, the last team coached by Pat Fitzgerald, was certainly pretty bad as well. But, man, it was tough to watch Purdue football, certainly, this year. Got another trio of bold predictions that were made in the preseason. This from George Paul Lewis a handful of months ago in the summer on Twitter. Michigan wins the Big Ten. That's bold. That was bold even then. And beats the team down south. Now they got the second part of that. They ended up beating the Ohio State Buckeyes 13-10 this Saturday. Of course, if you haven't heard about that already, you are living under the biggest rock of all rocks. But winning the Big Ten, yeah, that was a far stretch. It wasn't maybe inconceivable in the preseason, but it was certainly bold, right? Because in the preseason, I had Michigan going 10-2. They ended up finishing 7-5. So how I thought Michigan would go, and I talked about it in my season preview with Clayton Sayfie from the Wolverine at the beginning of the year, I said, Michigan at quarterback, they need 2016 Wilton Spate, they need 2021 Cade McNamara. They need a quarterback that's good enough, that can manage the game and protect the football. Davis Warren did not protect the football, certainly, in the first few weeks of the season. But I think really when you go beyond the quarterback position for Michigan, this defense was not elite. Now, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, they did their thing, right, all season long. Josiah Stewart was really good, certainly coming off the edge. They didn't have Will Johnson in the back half of the season as well, which certainly hurt them. But the rest of the secondary and these transfers that kind of came in to plug these holes, it just didn't translate, I think, to the level that Michigan maybe expected. I think the loss of Rod Moore was a big deal in the locker room, leadership, and on the football field. I think that was a big deal. This secondary outside of Will Johnson just was not very good. This Michigan defense as a whole just, was good, but it wasn't great, but it wasn't elite. Certainly up there. Now, their defensive line, of course, stepped up, played well against Indiana, played well against Ohio State, certainly late in the year. But this was not the Michigan defense we expected it to be. This was not the Michigan, because I think for Michigan to have that 10-win type of year, they needed to have an elite run game. They needed to have Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullins be a fantastic 1-2 combo. Khalil Mullins stepped up, and he was good. Donovan Edwards was not good. He was not good. I think that's safe to say. His legacy at Michigan is going to be stepping up in these big-time games, right? The national championship game, some of these Ohio State games, and making big-time plays to vault Michigan to a national championship and have a lot of success during that 3-year run with Jim Harbaugh. But he just was never consistent enough at Michigan to really be that top running back, to maybe be a 1,000-yard running back this season. He was kind of one of those guys I also looked at to possibly lead the Big Ten in rushing, and it just didn't happen this year. And I think the offensive line, it wasn't as an entire body of work. It wasn't, you know what you had, these Joe Moore Award, really good offensive lines the past few years with the Barnharts, with the Zinters, and some of those great leaders up front when you lost them. It took a little bit for this offensive line to kind of get their feet under them. But big props to Sharon Moore and Michigan. Finishing the season 3-2, they were competitive against Indiana, and boy, that Ohio State win, 4 in a row, is just absolutely gigantic. Jason Rolfs, 8050. This was a YouTube comment on the Bold Predictions video. Nebraska's schedule is a joke. They will start out 7-0 and a possible 10-2 record and make the college football playoff. Look, here's the deal with Nebraska. All right, I predicted them to go 8-4. They ended up finishing 6-6. This was just an inconsistent football team all year long. I thought they started off the season really well. Of course, I think the high of their season is going to be that 28-10 win over the Colorado Buffaloes. I think that was a big deal for Colorado. They put a lot of effort into playing well in that game, and they came out firing, right? And the margin of victory probably should have been a lot greater than what it was. They dominated Colorado on that specific night, which as Colorado got better, that became a better win for Nebraska this season. But just too much inconsistent play on offense and on defense. Like, the defense was really good against Colorado. It was really good against Ohio State. It was really good in some of these games, and then maybe some other games. That overtime loss to Illinois earlier in the season. Of course, that game against Indiana, right? Those were 2 losses back-to-back on the schedule, a bye week smacked in between them over there. And then you look at the offense. They had a stretch in the middle of the year where things really went south with Marcus Satterfield as the offensive coordinator. Now we'll see if Dana Holgorsen in this bowl game can carry a lot of momentum into the offseason for Nebraska offensively, but there was just a lot of frustration, and maybe that's what you get when you have a freshman quarterback like Dylan Raiola. I certainly think there was talent on this roster for Nebraska to win 8 games, but Nebraska just they continue to find different ways to kind of come up with similar results. Now, getting the bowl game is huge for the development of this team going forward. We'll see if they can springboard that into some more success next season. Ricky likes beer. This was on Twitter, and Ricky likes being right. Wisconsin fails to make a bowl game. This was a fairly bold prediction, all right, in the summertime, because this was a Wisconsin team that was coming off a 7-5 regular season. It was year 2 of Luke Fickell. They upgraded, a lot of people thought, at the quarterback position with Tyler Van Dyke. But I think the downtrend of Wisconsin football this year has a lot to do with the aforementioned TVD. I think the loss of him in the Alabama game for the season is the ultimate what-if for the Wisconsin Badgers. I think Wisconsin ends up going to a bowl game if Tyler Van Dyke is healthy for the entirety of the season. Now, TVD early in the year, he wasn't ultra impressive or outstanding, but Wisconsin was getting better offensively. We know through that 3-game winning streak, we know through that 3-game stretch, they were starting to run the football a little bit more, but Braden Locke was also turning the football over. He did not have a lot of development in relief for Tyler Van Dyke this season. This was a major disappointment. A major disappointment. They were sitting there at 5-2. They needed to win 1 game to go to a bowl game, and they couldn't get it done. They lose 5 straight. They lose the X. They lose the 22-year bowl streak. There's going to be some serious looking in the mirror for this Wisconsin program. Props to Ricky for making that call during the offseason. I cannot believe this is it for the regular season. You know, we make predictions. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. It's fun to open up the dialogue on what teams can kind of do going forward in the offseason, because we got signing day coming up. We got portal coming up. There's going to be a lot of movement. There's going to be a lot of action as teams build for 2025. Before I sign off here today, just want to kind of put out there for you Duck fans, For you Nittany Lion fans, I will find out very soon if I am going to the Big Ten championship game and covering that game in Indianapolis. So when I know, I will put that on social media so we can meet up and we can have all sorts of fun down there in Indianapolis. But until next time, it's going to be a jam-packed week, folks. You're going to want to be subscribed. You're going to want to tune in to everything that's happening over here. But until next time, I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching and listening to Big Nation. Make sure to subscribe and follow Big Ten Ted on X, YouTube, and podcast platforms to stay in the know on all things Big Ten football.